Is history subjective? When we speak of history, we typically speak of facts in history and narratives. At most, we agree things happened. The Bastille really was stormed in 1789. But here I will work to ontologize these very historical happenings. This paper will answer the question through 8 arguments, contending that by spatializing history, we can in fact ontologize history and locate historical objectivity, particularly as a result of subjectivity. Through an examination of space as ground, linking together phenomenological insights of Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty with the ontological undertakings of Hegel, Badiou, and Zizek, can we find that a subjective phenomenology leads us to an objective ontology, or more specifically, leads us to a dialectic of potentiality and event. 1. The indifference of space. The necessary step to making this trajectory is that of spatializing history. Why? Because if we are to spatialize history, we are able to view history as a dialectic of potentiality and event. We are, of course, used to temporalizing history, to examining effects of retroactivity upon its subjectivation. We can debate history's linearity as well as its cyclical nature and whether or not history really does progress. But here I want to instead shift our focus to space. What is space? Here I draw on the work of Hegel. In Philosophy of Nature, Hegel writes that space is indifferent continuity. It is pure indifference and indeterminacy. And yet to think of a pure space, just like to think of a pure nothing, is impossible, Hegel writes in Philosophy of Nature and Science of Logic, respectively. I emphasize space because, and this is critical, space is the indifference which gives rise to difference. It is form-giving, or more literally, and in a stronger sense, space is form. My argument hinges on space as the ground of dialectical movement, as a pure indifference that is imminently sublated by difference. Hegel writes that the contradiction inherent to space is that it is fundamentally a relation. Hence, to think space is in self impossible. This imminently moves us to consider 2 ways in which space is sublated, through the point and through time. A point is difference as such. If space is indifferent continuity, the point is the interruption of difference. A point by itself does not tell us much, but many points in relation introduce an interpretable difference. Points in space necessarily require orientation. Here I shift to Hegel's Science of Logic. In discussing the one and the void, it is the many ones that give rise to what Hegel calls the one-one. The one-one is the one which we have arbitrarily determined to be our stake in the ground. It is that which gets stuck and allows us to orient other points. A scientific corollary would be Ernst Mach in his discussion of relative and absolute space. In response to Newton's theory of absolute space, that there are specific quadrants of space with absolute identities, that there's an immutable center of the universe. Mach tells us that space is relative, however, we must pick a point of orientation in order to interpret data. He offers the stars, often. Thus, points are the difference introduced into the indifference of space, which orient us. Likewise, time is that which introduces a difference into space, effectively as a series of points whose contradiction is its own continuity that washes over these discrete points. I am a Hegelian, so sorry. In physics, we cannot measure space in itself. We measure differences in space over time. Time is the difference introduced into space that, like points, orient us based on an arbitrarily chosen stake in the ground. 2. Phenomenology of space. Let's look at what Heidegger says in his late piece, Art and Space. Quote, space, does it belong to the primal phenomena at the awareness of which men are overcome, as Goethe says, by an awe to the point of anxiety? For behind space, so it will appear, nothing more is given to which it could be traced back. Before space, there is not retreat to something else. Heidegger rightly points out, citing Goethe, we are reduced to a point of anxiety, angst, when confronted with pure space, because there's literally nothing left to grab onto. Thinking pure space or thinking the void is in this sense a dead end. It is for that reason that space is phenomenological ground for Heidegger. Thus, what we are demonstrating is that at bottom of ontology and phenomenology, we must begin and end with a pure indifference of space. We can also turn to the corporeal phenomenology of Merleau-Ponty, who describes space and phenomenology of perception as follows. At the core of the subject, space and perception in general mark the fact of his birth, the perpetual contribution of his corporeality, and a communication with the world more ancient than thought. And this is why they saturate consciousness and are opaque to reflection. The lability of levels gives a living experience of vertigo and nausea, which is the consciousness of and the horror caused by our contingency. Space is neither an object nor an act of connecting by the subject. One can neither observe it nor see it emerging from a constitutive operation, and this is how space can magically bestow upon the landscape its spatial determinations without itself ever appearing. Like Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty tells us that space is what is behind the final veil. It is the nothingness that likewise structures our physical experience. To Merleau-Ponty, corporeal phenomena are primarily structured by spatial intuition. This is the ground upon which further phenomena are built. Indeed, confronting space induces horror and vertigo because we confront our very contingency. Thus, what I hope to point out here is that we can draw a line between phenomenology and ontology through space as ground. 3, spatializing history, the point. So now that I've explained my framework for spatial indifference, I want to introduce a theory that spatializes history. I draw on Badiou. History in a Badiousian reading is marked by events. Events rupture the everyday with that which is impossible, or mathematically speaking, forbidden in a given equation. These unnameable happenings are called interventions. Interventions rip into the static, dull fabric of the quotidian. There is no reconciling them with the day-to-day. What is critical throughout the work of Badiou is the role of naming. It is by naming the event that we open a new world oriented around a new signifier and a site. Ultimately, naming is the introduction of a difference into an indifferent void. Foundational to Badiou's ontology, in fact, is that we name the void. This, he says, is the proper name of being. It is by naming the void that we begin to count, that we derive the cardinal numbers, 1, 2, 3, etc. Naming the void inculcates ontology for Badiou, since for him ontology is mathematics. Likewise, naming the event opens up a new world. It is by naming the unnameable intervention that we create this new world. The reason why we've introduced a difference into the indifferent void is that the event names that which is unnameable. It is itself split. It's contradictory. Time, Badiou writes, is a diagonal between events. It's what connects the ruptures in history. So I've begun to paint a picture of eventual ruptures that are oriented points in space, but here we have to ask, what is space? Section 4, spatializing history, space. In this section, I want to consider Gaston Bachelard's The Dialectic of Duration. In response to Bergson's emphasis on continuity, Bachelard paints the picture of a temporal dialectic between action and repose, reposer. To be in repose is to be lazily zoning out, to be at rest, to be doing, frankly, nothing rather than something. Bachelard writes, it will be seen that there is nothing more normal or more necessary than going to the limit and establishing the relaxation of function, the repose of functioning, the non-functioning of function, since function must obviously often stop functioning. We shall see that there is a fundamental heterogeneity at the very heart of lived, active, creative duration, and that in order to know or use time well, we must activate the rhythm of work and repose. Only idleness is homogeneous. That's great. We retain only what we conquer. We maintain only what we resume. Moreover, simply from the methodological point of view, it will always be in our interest to establish a connection between the dialectic of different entities and the fundamental dialectic of being and non-being. It's critical. So Bachelard develops a dialectic between action and repose, between that which occupies us and the moments we simply relax. Here I propose borrowing from Bachelard to develop a spatiality of historical repose. This answers our question, what is the historical space between events? How can we characterize the day-to-day? I call this historical repose. Historical repose I liken to blank space, which we can also call the void. It is the indifference between events. It's the potentiality for there to be a new event, the potentiality that all space holds. Historical repose is necessarily formless, indeterminate, and indifferent in itself. Thus, we've established our spatial dialectic of historical events and historical repose. Historical events are the ruptures that disrupt the blank, indeterminate space of the void. I liken this to points or ones. Historical events, like points or the one, are differences that are in themselves empty. We imbue events with meaning, and thus they're integrated into a new world or mathematically into a new equation as empty names. For Lacanians, we would call this creating a new S1. And historical repose is the space between events, the non-being that shapes being. It is the void that is constitutive of the one, and likewise that which is in a radical non-relation with the ones or with points. Events, like the one, are necessarily reorienting. They emerge out of the blank void, specifically after we have drawn a name from the void, as Badiou would say. 5, the artificiality of humanity. So now that we've developed a basic theory that spatializes history between events and repose, let's begin the steps necessary to ontologize history. It is here that I ask, does history exist? Badiou makes a very provocative argument that nature does not exist. Why is this the case for Badiou? Well, nature falls outside of history. It's not evental to Badiou. It's the smooth indifference external to logic, to mathematics, and therefore to ontology. History is often contrasted with nature. Hegel, for example, tells us that spirit, and by extension the spirit of history, is quote-unquote denatured. Nature is what spirit imagines is there when spirit is absent. Thus, the human is necessarily that which has differentiated herself from nature. Alenka Zupancic, in her book, What is Sex?, writes that humans are the defective animal. Human is nature's impasse, nature's contradiction, nature's gap, nature's real. In the work of Frank Ruda, he references Bataille's story of Neolithic man, who renders a bird mask in his first disassociation with nature. In donning the bird mask, man is at a distance from nature. He's impersonating nature, and thus denaturalizing himself in the process. The linguistic turn in the 20th century has highlighted language as the mediator between human and nature. We're at a distance from ourselves, mediated by language, and this is what differentiates us from animals and nature writ large. It is language that makes us self-aware, that renders self-consciousness possible. In Hegel's lectures on world history, he writes that history is humanity's self-awareness. Thus, history is an extension of our self-consciousness, and it is an extension of our division from nature. To Badiou, history is necessarily artificial. It's something we've named. As we articulated before, historic events must be named before they can take hold. It is the naming of the void that fundamentally ruptures humans with nature. We name non-being, introducing the most basic paradox that the nothing is. And it's not that Parmenides is wrong here. The nothing also, of course, is not. This is the paradox, that we can somehow name the nothing. According to Hegel in Science of Logic, determinate being, Bestimmtsein, is the unity of being and non-being. We determine things based on what they are and what they are not. In other words, that which we determine is necessarily artificial due to our linguistic imposition. And hence history as named events is likewise artificial in its determinacy. At the heart of determinate being is the paradox of non-being, the paradox of what is not, which is that we're naming space. Thus, history as an extension of naming events, as an extension of human self-consciousness, is something artificial, something that distinguishes us from nature. 6. Nature is just space. Does the artificiality of naming mean that history is not real? Does our mediation of nature via language mean that we can never know nature in itself? Does our dependence on language trap us in its prison? Not at all. And this is where this paper takes the risk of discussing the formal connection between history and nature. In our discussion of Hegel's space as indifferent continuity, I cited Hegel's philosophy of nature. Hegel's Naturphilosophie frames space as the ground of nature. Nature is this indifference until we apply points to it, until we as agential observers introduce difference. In his lectures, Alexander Kojev interprets Hegel's concluding paragraphs on phenomenology of spirit by stating that, quote, without man, nature would be space and only space, end quote. What does Kojev mean? I read this through Frank Ruda, who writes that nature is indifference. As Hegel famously said upon summiting the Alps, es ist so, so it is. Nature is simply indifferent continuity. It is simply space. It is only once we apply logic to nature that we introduce difference, that we introduce points. Hence, nature is effectively an open, indeterminate space until we entangle ourselves with it. 7. Threading history and nature. Slavoj Žižek has written extensively on quantum physics over the last 25 years, and it may seem like a strange connection to make here, but it's actually incredibly critical. What quantum physics teaches us is that our measurements fundamentally alter the ontological makeup of nature. When we observe an atom, we force it to determine a spin, either clockwise or counterclockwise. This is the collapse of materialism and idealism that Žižek discusses elsewhere in his work on Hegel and Lacan. The idealists get it wrong if we take the extreme example that I close my eyes and the world disappears. Likewise, the materialists get it wrong if we take the other extreme example that the world out there is completely independent of my interiority. To collapse these two positions yields the following, that our subjectivity is entangled with nature, that as we measure nature, as we determine nature, we affect its actual ontological makeup. We force it to determine the atom is either clockwise or counterclockwise, rotating that is. We force it to determine via uniting its being and its non-being. It's rotating clockwise and not counterclockwise. Again, it's the application of logic to nature that introduces differences, that introduces events into history. Thus, quantum physicists like Carlo Rovelli are tempted to conclude that nature is evental. I quote him. I argue here it's not quite the right formulation, but they're not far off. It's the application of the observer's measurement that imposes events onto nature. It's this act of naming, this application of difference to that which is otherwise indifferent that imposes events onto nature. Importantly, it's not that we're finding a seemingly random connection between science and philosophy. The brilliant intervention from quantum physics is precisely that it takes the role of observer into account. The data is not divorced from the measuring stick, and we can actually see that the measuring stick transforms what is before it. A pure space of potentiality is transformed into an actualized reality. The potentiality of the particle spinning clockwise was 50% before observation, and after observation, it's transformed to 100%. The point is that our measurement, our naming, changes the ontological makeup of nature, and this is why spatializing the atom is critical. We've transformed a space, a cloud of indifference, a space of indeterminacy into an actualized point. And this brings us to the crux of the argument. The same is true for history. When we name events, we transform the historical repose, the empty space of potentiality, into actuality. We name events, thus determining history. And just like measuring the atom, effectively naming the atom, it is named, it is determined to be clockwise or counterclockwise. The naming of a historical event forces its actuality, taking it out of the indeterminate void of historical repose and granting it actuality. We can understand that naming events in the continual reference to the named event as ontologically constitutive. The event is just as the electron really is spinning clockwise. The way we measure nature by naming it is formally the same construction as the way we name history. My argument here is that nature and history are ontologically constituted through the same formal structure. More specifically, the names we apply to nature and to historic interventions are what integrate them into ontology. Thus, Badiou is not wrong when he says that nature does not exist if we employ this framework. Nature as pure space is that which lies outside of naming. Historic repose is likewise outside of named events. But I recommend we view this in a less striated sense of what exists and what does not exist. I instead recommend we be more specific and call this a dialectic between potentiality and event. The same ontological formalism is present in the potentiality of the atom spin and the potentiality of historic repose, and likewise the rupturing of the historic event and the measurement of the atom. What we see here is that there is, in a stronger sense than saying this exists and that does not exist, that there is an entanglement between subject and object. The subject's observation fundamentally changes the ontological nature of the object. The storming of the Bastille is ontologically transformed when we name it, just like the electron spin. Thus, there is subject and object, but in a truly Hegelian sense, both as subject and as substance, we must recognize that subject and substance are fundamentally ontologically entangled. 8. Conclusion and the point of collapse. We've answered the question we posed at the start, is history subjective? My thesis is that it is necessarily through subjectivity that history's objectivity is constituted. Historical events are the interruptions in the potential empty space of historic repose. It is the introduction of a difference into indifference. It is the mapping of a point in an otherwise indeterminate space. It is the introduction of a one into the void. So is history subjective? It is objective only through subjective entanglement. Otherwise, it is simply potentiality, i.e. it's simply open space. History is as real as self-consciousness. It is the mediation of ourselves, which entangles itself with nature. Thus, I conclude that history's objectivity is necessarily a result of subjectivity, specifically of subjective entanglement between subject and substance that collapses idealism and materialism, phenomenology and ontology. Thank you.